When a woman is not interested, most men immediately assume the situation is fixed and unchangeable. That assumption leads to chasing, overexplaining, or trying to force attraction through effort. But attraction is not static. It shifts based on behavior, perception, and emotional experience over time. What she feels about you is not only based on who you are, but how you show up in relation to her expectations and emotional environment. The mistake is thinking you can convince someone into wanting you. That approach creates pressure, and pressure reduces attraction. What actually changes her perception is contrast. When she experiences a version of you that is emotionally stable, self-directed, and not dependent on her response, it disrupts the mental frame she formed when interest dropped. This does not mean chasing harder or trying to impress. It means recalibrating your presence so she is no longer interacting with emotional neediness or predictable patterns. Attraction often returns when the dynamic feels different, not when it feels intensified. In this breakdown, you will learn how to shift your behavior in a way that can create space for renewed interest, without begging, without forcing, and without losing control of your self-respect. 1. Remove emotional pressure completely. The first step in shifting how a woman perceives you when she has lost interest is to remove all emotional pressure from your interaction with her. Because pressure is the fastest way to reinforce disinterest and lock you into the same category she already stepped away from. So the goal is not to try harder, explain more, or push for clarity. It is to step out of the emotional urgency that is driving your behavior, meaning you stop seeking reassurance through repeated contact, stop trying to fix the situation through long emotional messages, and stop trying to get her to validate where you stand, because all of that creates weight, and weight kills curiosity. Instead, you move into a calmer state where your communication no longer carries expectation, where you are not emotionally reacting to her distance, and where you are not trying to manage her perception through effort. Another key part of removing pressure is understanding that silence or space is not something to panic about. It is actually where perception resets, because when you stop filling every gap with messages or emotional attempts to reconnect, she is no longer experiencing you as someone pushing for attention. She is experiencing space. And space changes how memory and perception work. It allows her to observe your absence without constant emotional interruption, and that can slowly create contrast if there is anything left to build on. Another important detail is that emotional pressure often shows up in subtle ways, not just obvious chasing. It can be over-explaining your intentions, trying to clarify misunderstandings repeatedly, or reacting strongly to small signs of distance, and all of these behaviors signal dependence. So removing pressure means controlling not just your actions, but your emotional reactions as well. You stop responding from anxiety and start responding from calm awareness. And that shift alone begins to separate you from the version of you she previously disengaged from. Because now she is no longer interacting with emotional tension, she is interacting with neutrality, and neutrality is the foundation where curiosity can return if anything is going to change, but only if it is maintained consistently. Because inconsistency reintroduces pressure immediately and resets the dynamic back to where it started. So the real focus here is stability, emotional control, and removal of urgency from every interaction, not as a tactic, but as a correction of the behavior. That created disinterest in the first place, because without removing pressure, nothing else you do will create a different outcome. It will only reinforce the existing one. 2. Rebuild your frame through self-direction. After removing emotional pressure, the next shift is rebuilding your internal frame so your life is no longer emotionally orbiting her response. Because when your attention is centered on whether she is interested or not, your behavior becomes reactive. And reactive behavior is exactly what keeps attraction low, so the correction is to shift your focus back onto your own direction, goals, routines, and priorities, not as distraction, but as structure, meaning your time, attention, and emotional energy are anchored in things that do not depend on her engagement, and this internal shift is what changes how you carry yourself when you do interact with her, because now your presence is not shaped by uncertainty or emotional dependence. It is shaped by stability and direction, and that difference is noticeable even without words. Another key aspect of self-direction is that you stop assigning hidden meaning to her behavior, because overanalysis keeps you emotionally locked into her actions. Instead, you treat her responses as neutral information rather than emotional signals that require immediate interpretation, and this helps you detach from the cycle of reacting to every small change in her tone or availability. Another important detail is that self-direction creates emotional independence, where your mood is no longer fluctuating based on whether she replies, how fast she replies, or how she engages. And this stability reduces emotional intensity in the interaction, which is necessary if perception is going to reset, because emotional intensity from one side creates imbalance, and imbalance kills attraction over time. So by rebuilding your frame around your own life, you naturally reduce that imbalance without needing to say anything. Another key point is that self-direction also changes how you respond when she does engage, because now you are not over-investing in every interaction. You are not trying to extract meaning or validation from each message. You are simply responding from a grounded position where your attention is selective, calm, and not driven by anxiety, and this creates a new version of you in her perception, one that is no longer emotionally dependent or predictable, but instead centered and self-contained, and that shift is what allows the dynamic to change if there is any potential left, because she is no longer interacting with someone trying to get something from her emotionally. She is interacting with someone who is already anchored in his own direction, and that contrast is what can reopen curiosity without pressure, without chasing, and without forcing any outcome, but only if it is consistent and not performed temporarily. Because self-direction must become your default state, not a strategy you switch on and off depending on her behavior. 3. Create contrast, not chasing behavior. Once your frame is stable and self-directed, the next shift is creating contrast in how she experiences you compared to before, because attraction does not usually return from repetition of the same behavior. It returns when there is noticeable difference in emotional tone, availability, and presence, and that contrast cannot be created through chasing, over-explaining, or trying to re-enter her attention forcefully. Instead, it comes from behavioral change that is calm, consistent, and not reactive to her distance, meaning you are no longer trying to regain her interest through effort. You are allowing her to experience a different version of you that is not emotionally predictable or dependent on her validation. And this shift matters because she already formed a mental reference point based on how you showed up previously. So if nothing changes in her perception. But when your behavior changes in a stable way, her reference point is disrupted, and that disruption creates space for reevaluation. Another key part of contrast is emotional tone, where you stop engaging with urgency or anxiety and instead communicate in a grounded, neutral way that does not carry hidden pressure or expectation. And this makes interactions feel lighter and less emotionally loaded, which is important because emotional heaviness is one of the main reasons attraction declines. So removing it creates a noticeable shift. Another detail is availability contrast, where you are no longer instantly accessible or constantly initiating contact, not as a tactic to trigger reaction, but as a natural result of having your attention focused elsewhere. And this changes how your presence is experienced because she is no longer receiving constant engagement from you. She is experiencing space, and that space forces a different type of perception compared to constant availability. Another important point is that contrast must be consistent to be effective because inconsistent behavior signals instability, and instability recreates the same impression that led to disinterest. So the change has to be steady and internal, not temporary or performative. And over time, this consistency allows her to see a version of you that is no longer aligned with the emotional pattern she disengaged from, which creates mental friction between old perception and current reality. And that friction is where curiosity can begin to form again if anything is still possible, but only if you avoid slipping back into old patterns of chasing or emotional reactivity, because every return to those behaviors erases the contrast you built. So the goal is not intensity, it is difference maintained through calm control. And that is what gives your presence a new reference point in her mind without forcing any emotional outcome or demanding validation. 4. Stop seeking validation through her reactions. At this stage, one of the biggest obstacles to regaining attraction is the need for validation, where you still measure your value based on how she responds, whether she replies, how quickly she engages, or whether she shows any signs of warmth. And this mindset keeps you emotionally tied to outcomes instead of behavior, which weakens everything you are trying to rebuild, because even if you change your actions externally, internal dependence will always leak through in subtle ways like overexplaining, overchecking, or reacting too strongly to small signals. So the real shift is removing her reactions as a source of emotional confirmation, meaning you stop treating her responses as indicators of your worth or progress, and instead see them as neutral data that does not define your direction. Another key part of this is emotional neutrality in communication, where you are no longer trying to impress her through messages or extract a positive reaction. You are simply communicating without hidden expectation, and this changes the energy of every interaction because it removes pressure from both sides. Another important detail is that validation seeking often shows up in small behaviors like double texting, overanalyzing delays, or trying to re-engage conversations that naturally ended, and these behaviors signal emotional dependence even if the content of your messages seems normal. So removing validation seeking means controlling these impulses and allowing space without immediately trying to fill it. Another key point is that when you stop seeking validation, you naturally become less reactive. And that reduction in reactivity changes how you are perceived because you are no longer emotionally predictable or easily influenced by her behavior. Instead, you become steady, and steadiness is what creates room for reassessment. But only if it is consistent over time, because temporary restraint followed by emotional relapse resets the entire dynamic. Another important aspect is understanding that validation from her is not a requirement for rebuilding attraction, because attraction is influenced more by perception of stability, independence, and emotional control than by direct approval. So when you detach from needing her feedback, you actually increase your ability to influence perception indirectly through behavior, and this is where many men fail because they stay focused on trying to get a reaction instead of becoming someone who knows longer depends on one, and once that shift happens fully, your presence becomes less about seeking response and more about existing in a stable state that she has to interpret on her own without pressure or emotional demand shaping the interaction. 5. Rebuild attraction through emotional neutrality. After removing validation seeking, the next step is to operate from emotional neutrality, which means your presence around her no longer swings between trying to impress and trying to fix things. Instead, it stays consistent, grounded, and unaffected by her level of engagement. And this matters because emotional volatility is one of the biggest factors that reduces attraction, especially when a woman has already started pulling away. So the correction is to stop attaching emotional meaning to every interaction, every delay, or every response, and instead treat communication as neutral exchange rather than emotional measurement. Another key part of emotional neutrality is how you respond when she engages, because many men fall back into overinvestment the moment they get attention again, but that behavior immediately recreates the imbalance that caused disinterest in the first place. So instead, your responses should remain measured, calm, and free of hidden urgency, meaning you are not trying to extract validation, you are not trying to extend every conversation endlessly, and you are not trying to prove anything through effort. Another important detail is that emotional neutrality also means you do not react strongly to distance, because reacting emotionally signals dependence, while staying steady signals control, and that control is what changes perception over time. Another aspect is that neutrality removes pressure from her side as well, because when she no longer feels emotional weight coming from you, the interaction becomes lighter, and lightness is what allows curiosity to re-enter if it is going to return at all, because curiosity cannot exist in pressure-heavy environments. It only exists when space and calmness are present. Another key point is that emotional neutrality does not mean emotional coldness. It means emotional independence, where your internal state is not dictated by her behavior. And this is crucial because independence changes how You are experienced in interaction. She is no longer interacting with someone who is emotionally reactive or seeking constant reassurance. She is interacting with someone who is stable regardless of external response. And that stability creates contrast compared to previous behavior, which is necessary for perception to shift, but only if it is consistent and not performed temporarily, because emotional neutrality must become your default state. Not a reaction to her distance, and when maintained properly, it slowly removes the emotional tension that previously existed in the dynamic, allowing space for natural reassessment without forcing any outcome. And that reassessment is only possible when the interaction is no longer driven by emotional pressure or validation-seeking behavior, but instead exists in a calm, controlled, and neutral state that does not demand anything from her while still maintaining your presence with clarity and self-control. 6. Let distance work without interference. At this stage, one of the most important things you can do is allow distance to exist without trying to interfere with it, because distance is not the enemy of attraction when handled correctly. It is actually the space where perception adjusts and recalibration happens, but most men destroy that process by trying to close the gap too quickly, sending messages to break silence, or attempting to restart emotional momentum before any real shift has taken place, and that interference prevents any natural reassessment from forming. So the correct approach is to let distance exist without emotional disruption, meaning you do not chase closure, you do not demand clarity, and you do not try to force reconnection through urgency. Instead, you allow time and space to do their work while maintaining your internal stability. Another key part of this is resisting the urge to interpret silence as failure, because silence is not rejection in itself. It is simply absence of interaction. And when you assign emotional meaning to it too early, you fall back into reactive behavior, which destroys the progress you are trying to build. Another important detail is that distance creates contrast only when your behavior remains consistent during it. Because if you panic, overreach, or try to reinsert yourself emotionally, the contrast disappears and she returns to the original perception of you as emotionally dependent. But if you remain stable during distance, without shifting into anxiety-driven actions, then the version of you she experiences during silence becomes different from the one she disengaged from, and that difference is what creates space for reevaluation. Another aspect is that distance also reveals clarity, because when you are not constantly interacting, you begin to see whether any effort comes from her side at all, and that information is more valuable than constant communication, because it shows whether there is genuine curiosity or none at all. And reacting to that information emotionally only clouds your judgment, so the goal is to observe without interfering, to let behavior unfold naturally without trying to control it, and to avoid turning distance into a problem that needs to be solved. Because when you treat distance as something to fix, you immediately return to chasing behavior, which resets the dynamic. But when you treat distance as part of the recalibration process, you stay grounded and avoid emotional regression. And that stability is what gives any possibility of renewed interest a chance to emerge naturally, because attraction cannot rebuild under pressure. It can only be observed and influenced indirectly through calm consistency and non-reactive presence over time. 7. Reintroduce interaction only from strength. The final step in this process is reintroducing interaction only when your internal state, behavior, and presence are stable enough that you are no longer seeking validation or emotional reassurance from the outcome. Because if you return too early or from the wrong emotional position, you undo everything you built through distance, neutrality, and self-direction. So timing and intention matter more than frequency, and when you do re-engage, it should come from a grounded place where you are not trying to regain her attention, but simply expressing yourself without attachment to how she responds. And this is important because reintroduction from strength changes the emotional tone completely compared to reintroduction from need. Another key detail is that your communication should remain simple, calm, and free from pressure, meaning you are not trying to restart deep emotional conversations immediately, you are not trying to address past issues in a heavy way, and you are not trying To rebuild closeness through intensity, instead you are allowing interaction to restart naturally without forcing it into a direction. Another important aspect is that you must maintain consistency in your new version of behavior, because inconsistency immediately signals that the change was temporary and emotionally driven, which brings the dynamic back to its original state. So every interaction must reflect the same grounded emotional tone you developed during distance. Another key point is that you should not overinterpret her response when you re-engage, because reacting strongly to positive or negative signals immediately puts you back into validation-seeking behavior. Instead, you maintain neutrality regardless of outcome, which reinforces your emotional independence and prevents regression. Another detail is that reintroduction is not about proving transformation. It is about demonstrating it naturally through behavior without explanation. Because explaining change is less powerful than embodying it, and when she experiences you in this new state consistently, she either recalibrates her perception or confirms disinterest. But either way, you remain stable, and that stability is the real objective. Not forcing a specific reaction, another important aspect is that you must be willing to stop interaction completely if it does not move in a healthier direction, because re-engaging without boundaries leads back into old cycles, and boundaries protect the progress you have made. So reintroduction is only effective when it comes from a position where you are fully prepared for any outcome, not emotionally dependent on one, and that mindset ensures that your behavior stays clean, controlled, and aligned with self-respect rather than emotional urgency. And when all of these elements are combined, your presence becomes fundamentally different from the version she previously disengaged from, giving the only real chance for interest to reemerge naturally through contrast, not pressure, not chasing, and not emotional dependency. At the end of everything, making a woman want you again is never about forcing emotions or trying to manufacture attraction through effort. It always comes down to how you manage yourself when interest is low or gone. Because that is where your real position is revealed, not in how you behave when things are easy, but in how you behave when they are uncertain, and if you stay calm, grounded, and self-directed through that uncertainty, you automatically separate yourself from the version of you she mentally stepped away from. But if you collapse into chasing, over-explaining, or emotional pressure, you reinforce the same pattern that caused disinterest in the first place. So the real focus is always internal correction before external action, meaning your emotional state, your boundaries, and your consistency matter more than any message you send. And once those are stable, your presence naturally carries a different weight without you needing to force anything, because people respond to stability and clarity more than intensity, and when that stability is missing, no amount of communication can compensate for it. So the goal is not to win her back through effort. It is to become someone who no longer operates from emotional dependence, and from that position, whatever she chooses to do becomes secondary to your own direction, which is the only place where real control and respect are maintained in any dynamic like this.